Welcome to After Further Consideration, a DEI-focused podcast brought to you by Enrollify and Element 451. I'm Dr. Cody Nielsen, Executive Director of Convergent Strategies and Higher Education faculty member.
And I'm Dr. Tamika Ferguson, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Inclusive Excellence, and an Assistant Professor at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Education. We're sitting down with seasoned change leaders for candid chats about responsive leadership, addressing campus crises, navigating institutional shifts, and fostering sustainable change, all through the lens of equity and inclusion.
Join us every other Tuesday to learn about these leaders' real-life challenges, lessons learned, and the innovative solutions they develop to tackle these complex issues.
Our goal is to help you drive positive and inclusive change on your campus.
After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify Network, a community of innovators, thinkers, and doers dedicated to revolutionizing higher education. Learn new skills, find your next big idea, and network with the industry's best minds at enrollify.org.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform, helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.
Today's guest is Dr. Faran Saeed, Director of the Murseel J. Lee Scholars Program at the University of Wisconsin and former Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Wisconsin's Global and International Division. Previously, Faran has worked at Oregon State University as well as the University of Virginia. His work includes volunteer service on NASPA's Spirituality and Religion Knowledge Community and with Convergence on Campus, which just so happens to be my organization. So this is how Faran and I know each other. So Faran, it's a pleasure to have you on today's episode and finally get you on the podcast.
Well, I just want to say thank you both for just allowing me the opportunity to be in community with each of you and just be able to share my knowledge, my expertise, just my story, just not with you both, but just whoever listens to the podcast. I'm excited to just be here. So thank you.
Yeah, we're really excited too. And as we start today, some of us know you a little bit better than others. And obviously our listeners, I want them to know about your work. So we'd like you to sort of back us up. Tell us a little bit more about your own leadership story and how you ended up in this role, and just sort of take us through that story of how you ended up doing this work in higher education.
Yeah, I think you have to start back to when I was in undergrad at the University of Memphis, right? My career looked very different. I was a biochemistry major on my way to go to medical school, super involved in campus. I liked science, but I didn't love it, right? And I realized there were a lot of people that just, didn't have the same identities as me that were in kind of higher education, right? In these positions that were high touch points for students. So thinking about the dean of students and advisors, there's not a lot of Muslim, South Asian people in those roles, right? And I never really had that support there. And so, that ultimately led me to make a career shift, right? Just recognizing that I, liked science, but I didn't love it. And I loved this piece where I needed to be able to support my community where no one else was going to be able to do that. And so I kind of put that on myself. And so that really started this journey into higher education, right? And, there's points within my leadership story where, I almost left higher ed just because I just did not feel like there was representation. When I was at LSU, right, I went to my first ACPA and saw maybe 5 people that had the same identity as me and just really frustrated. And it really was a conversation with a couple of peers who were kind of going through the same thing that kind of solidified that I needed to stay in this. And so part of my leadership story and who I am is my values, right? I'm a very values-oriented person. I feel like I'm an active citizen. Community is part of my life choices, my life values. So that really got me into the sphere of community engagement, civic engagement, and volunteerism. So a lot of my professional work really focuses around that work. And so I really enjoyed that piece, right? Being able to connect with campus partners, community partners, our students, and be able to support them in a very intentional way. And then, there's this connection between community engagement and diversity, equity, inclusion, right? This piece around, we don't want to have our students go into communities and dictate what those needs are We also want to make sure that we don't create a savior complex. We want to make sure that people are being welcome in there to those communities. And so, that's really kind of where my like shift happened a little bit in terms of me shifting from community engagement to multiculturalism, or multicultural affairs, diversity, equity, inclusion work, which then led me to the work that I did at Oregon State University, kind of in the same realm, overseeing one of the cultural centers. And then got me to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I oversaw all the global DEI pieces. So I saw all the DEI initiatives for a division of 8,000 faculty, staff, and students. And then, because of the stuff that's been going around DEI and kind of the political climate, I had to make a pivot to my current role, which is the director of the Murseel J Scholars Program. And some information about the Murseel J Scholars Program. It's the most prestigious scholarship program here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's been around for 40 years. It is a scholarship that's primarily focused on students who have been historically disadvantaged in their educational opportunities, right? So, majority of our students happen to be students of color. We have students that come from rural backgrounds that are also part of our scholarship program, and we provide them an opportunity to be able to have full tuition, a book stipend, and being able to support them in their academic journey. And that program has been around, and we have about 500 students in our program that are fully funded. We have a large endowment, so I had the opportunity to be able to lead that. And so I never thought I'd go back to kind of a student-facing program after being focused on DEI for a whole division, right? But I think it's been really good to be able to still support students, and still be able to focus on some of these core values that I hold. And so it's been a good change, right? Shifting back into kind of the student facing program, even though I don't necessarily interact with students on a daily basis like a lot of the advisors do. Be able to set the strategic priorities, being able to make sure that the organization and our department or organization is financially well off, and making sure that we are able to support many more students. The institution is committed to this. And so it's been really great, right? Like I've been able to still be able to do a lot of the diversity, equity, inclusion work in terms of the strategic planning, making sure those values are incorporated and weaved in. But it's also been great to see kind of students go through their 4-year progression and be able to take what we've taught them and then graduate and become active citizens, both in Wisconsin and also the nation and the world.
Faran, I enjoy your story because I think sometimes folks feel like if you do DEI work, that's all you have of value to the institution and to the field. And
Yeah.
your story definitely demonstrates that you can have multiple skill sets and can offer so much more than what people might try to pigeonhole you in, because that
Mm-hmm.
identity and values, community engagement, all of those things have so much importance to you. So one thing I'm really interested in following up on in your story is the values piece. I think
Yeah.
that that's something that's come up a lot with folks that we've talked to on this podcast, that values seem to be really driving a lot of work of the leaders. Could you talk more about why values driven work and is so important to you, and how does that show up as a supervisor and as a mentor or as a leader for the 500 students who are part of the scholarship program?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think for me to be able to, one, exemplify kind of the values that I hold. So one of the values that I hold is, using a critical lens, right, within every aspect of our program. And for me, society and higher ed operates in systems of oppression. I think that's really important for us to recognize, right? The events that we're holding, right? Where are we holding those events? Can be a simple thing as, is this a space that is conducive to being a safe space, a space where students feel they belong? Those are things that I take very strongly in kind of my values. And when I look at kind of the strategic priorities for our program, do I look at, the activities that we do, or is this activity going to elicit a negative response from our students because maybe it's tone deaf, right? Those are the things that I'm thinking of with that critical lens, which I think is part of the values that I hold, right? Another piece is, you know, this thing where I call like speed of trust, where change happens and solidarity grows when we're in a relationship with each other, right? So this work that we do is all relationship oriented. And so for me, when I work with our community partners, our campus partners, I'm constantly, calling to check in on them. And, that simple thing, picking up a phone call, even when we're not having any kind of interaction in that very moment, right? Or it's, offering to be able to say, we as a program can provide some monetary funding so that way you can better your program, right? We didn't have to do that. But that it's something showing that we're good stewards of our money and good partners. And so for me, that's how I've been able to do that within the organization here, right? I've been able to partner with different campus partners, such as the School of Education here at the University of Wisconsin, right? Creating opportunities where our students who are interested in research in graduate schools can be able to be mentored by our faculty within those specific areas. We didn't have that school. We didn't have that piece before me joining there. And so now we have it set up that we're going to have a open forum where we'll have 10 faculty members come and be able to talk to our students and then talk about what does it entail to apply for graduate school? How does the funding work? What are the best research projects that we can focus on that specifically your area? We're hoping to have about 100 plus of our scholars at this event. And that's something that wasn't there. And that's reflected also with our staff, right? Our staff is using a critical lens when it comes to their advising appointments. They're making sure that the agenda is not something just transactional, but making sure that we're, focusing on empathy and making sure that the students are being supported the best way that they can. And that's getting input on, what kind of programming do you want, right? It used to be just us kind of dictating based on our own knowledge that these are the programs that are best for our students. Well, how are we basing that, right? Are we following best practices? Are we listening to our students? Are we surveying them to get their pulse? And that's something that I've really tried to do with my values to lead with that. And so we revamped our whole strategic plan when I got in here. We did a kind of assessment, a SWOT analysis of what's working, what's not working. Got buy-in from our staff. And I'm proud to say that because that I've been able to lead with my values for the first time in years for this organization, we're at a full team. It's never been a full team from their recollection for the last 5 years. Staff are excited. I'm focusing on their professional development. I'm focusing on the development of our students. And I think it all starts with being in line with your values. And, I've named 2 of my values, and those have really showed up.
It's clear that you're proud of it, by the way.
Thank you.
Because as you were talking, the folks listening can't hear, but you got more passionate as you went along, especially when you started talking about your staff. And I think that as someone who supervises a large team, we still have to make sure that we're modeling values, not just for our students, but for our staff, because they matter so much to us. And at an institution where students can just be the main focus, we still have to spend as much time making sure that our staff are being poured into and that they're having opportunities to bring their full selves to work and not just be so selfless in their work that they are not finding value in what they do. Is that they're always about just output and outcomes and giving. So I really appreciate how you really responded to that question, because it shows that your values goes into your student-centered work. And it also goes into how you show up as a leader, which is very interesting to me. So one of the questions that we'd love to dive into is really learning more about how you've shifted as a leader. So could you maybe share 1 or 2 specific defining moments throughout your career that have shifted how you lead? And that can be professional, it can be whatever it is, but what are those things that have shifted you as a leader, that have caused some change, some reflection? I'm really interested in learning more about those.
Yeah. Tamika, I think that's a great question. And I think you could resonate because you're an alum of this institution, but the University of Virginia really, when neo-Nazis and white supremacists came to Charlottesville, and the impact that had on faculty, staff, students, our community, was really a life-defining point in my career.
Yes.
Where I felt like we were good, right? We were good in our organization prior to that, right? I felt like we were doing well, but we were doing the bare minimum. And that was something that made me realize that there was so much more that we could be focused on. And that crisis showed that we as an organization, we as an institution, were not supporting our students in the way they needed to be supported through our actions. And so that for me was a specific instance where I just realized that myself as a leader, I needed to be able to be there for everyone that was involved, right? And that really means holding one true to my values, but then also making sure that I'm willing to be able to go to bat, which could result in your career being impacted, right? Like there was points where I made decisions based on wanting to support our faculty, staff, and students where my job was on the line because some of the decisions I made, I will say, were not met with maybe great enthusiasm. And granted, I could have done some things better there, but really, when we had that event there and me responding to that was kind of, where I had that shift where I needed to, one, realize that, one, I need to be able to take accountability for the ways that our organization had perpetuated these stereotypes, assumptions, and biases within, our policies, within our messaging, or a lack thereof messaging prior to that event. I realized for me that I really need to focus more on understanding and recognizing power dynamics and be able to mitigate that. And then I also realized for me, I need to be focused on centering those impacted communities, right? I think that, and then also maybe balancing immediate needs versus long-term goals, and knowing that these immediate needs, the decisions I made might be negative, but long term it would set up our organization for success, right? And I'm happy to dive into kind of what are the things that I did, but I think it made me shift my thought process where I really needed to make sure I'm centering impacted communities, recognizing these power dynamics, particularly, what am I allowed to say versus, I report directly to a board, the UVA board of directors. I had a direct supervisor. That's very different with some of the messaging that I was sent out compared to what they probably would have wanted me to send out to our stakeholders. But then I also realized I had to be able to take accountability for the work that we did. And I know one of the things that I want to share with you all, kind of the things that I did that was life defining was, in terms of that crisis, some steps that I really did take was, one, I did have a communication plan. I think that's really important to have with any kind of crisis is coming. I made sure that we had messaging ready to go for all the different stakeholders, right? So we had messaging set for our students who are volunteering. I had messaging set for our campus partners. I had messaging set. We had a text system where I could send a message out to all our volunteers. And as you know, we have 4,000 students volunteering on a weekly basis at that organization when I was at UVA leading that. And so I made the decision that we had a communications plan, and I think that was really helpful. Everyone was on the same page, right? We sent a message out to the students, please do not come to volunteer that day for safety. Send a message out to our community partners to let them know that we will not be having volunteers coming that day. For people had an idea what was going to happen, and of course it happened. That was the right way. I think that's an actionable step that I think anyone can do, is to be able to have a communication plan when we have an incident of that magnitude, right? I think two is some actual step is that I made sure to be able to have a public statement to show our support, but then be able to back that up. And at the time I was pretty open about the statement. I said, I let people know that we as an organization had failed. We had perpetuated a lot of these assumptions and biases. There's a reason why there was a lot of staff, faculty, and students of color who maybe didn't want to partner with our organization. And me verbalizing that and naming that in the long run was great. It helped us realize that we were owning our mistakes. I think the short term, when we think about me responding to like the board of directors, maybe wasn't the messaging they want. But then again, that's me taking accountability for our organization and standing by that. So that's when I talk about that short term negative impact. But then long term, I think that would help us out. And I can tell you to this day and Charlottesville that the university is still navigating, rebuilding those relationships. But because I was able to be proactive, we as an organization had better relationships with our community partners than I would say the institution had with those same community partners. I also did reflective spaces for our students, right? We made sure our center was 24-hour access, where students can come there and feel that they had a community. So we changed our policy where students had access through their student ID to our organization. I work with counseling and psychological services, where we had trained staff members there on site to be able to provide mental health support for our students. So these are some things that I think you can really be able to do, right? as actionable steps. But I would say that Charlottesville was really like life defining for me, where I realized that I need to be able to put myself out there in a way that, could cause me harm, both bodily or just professionally. And I think that's important because I can't live with myself if I didn't do anything in that moment. And I don't regret any of the things that I did.
I think this is such an important story because I feel like Charlottesville and what happened at UVA in 2017 is such a sort of moment that we sort of remember in higher education. I think it gets swept up often with the sort of political dynamics of it, but it happened on a campus to a campus community within a larger scope of larger political constructs. And so I think this sort of like illustrates, I think, for the listeners, sort of one of those sort of recalling back to those moments. We often on this podcast talk with our guests about sort of applying a sort of equity focused lens in your decision making process. You allude to that, and you're sort of already getting to that question a little bit. You started a ways back talking a little bit about the power dynamics. And I'm wondering if you could sort of help our audience understand a little bit more what you mean by that. I think a lot of us have understandings about power dynamics, but you were in a specific circumstance at a specific time. Could you maybe sort of help us by explaining what you mean in terms of your own power dynamics, how you were navigating those situations politically, and then maybe even open it up to sort of like power dynamics in higher education for us a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's really important for us to understand what power dynamics means. I think it comes from power and privilege that are at play, right? Both within our organization, within the broader community, within the universities, um, you know, stakeholders, who are the people that are at power. And so for me, this lens that you talk about helped me identify blind spots so that way we can be able to address these disparities and how resources and supports were distributed during that time, right? No, when we think about Charlottesville, we think about the decisions that were made, right? Or the lack of decisions that were made when it comes to supporting our students. Our students at that time right there were surrounded by 300 neo-Nazis. There was no intervention that happened, right? The police didn't intervene to support our students. We also had the dean of students at the time there to try to support students who had his shirt ripped off by the neo-Nazis and white supremacists there. And so when you think about power dynamics, I'm thinking about the messaging that's being sent, right, to different stakeholders. For example, there was different messaging that was sent to students versus staff and faculty by senior leadership, right? That's shows me the power dynamics there, what messaging are being said. And I think this highlights to me that there's this big pressure on trying to be able to make a decision that will support everyone in that moment. Instead, you're always going to have that one or two groups that whatever decision you make is going to be upset about it. And I think I think people that are having this are that are in positions of power are really trying to grapple with that, right? Like, how do we make a decision, or how do I use my power to be able to, one, support our students, but if I make a decision, it could have the adverse effect on it where we could lose, potential donors, right? Like, based on the university could have came out and said like, hey, we as an university have failed our students. We have perpetuated a lot of these stereotypes. That could have caused a lot of drama when it comes to like potential, big donors, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that people that are at people in these positions of power are having to kind of grapple with kind of making a decision, right? And with what information that they have. And then within their power, there are blind spots within how resources are allocated. And I think this is, take Charlottesville out of it. I think just general around higher education, there are certain resources that are, dedicated to certain groups more than others, right? Based on just like your identity, your background, your cause, your mission, your values, right? Yeah, so I guess that's where I want to leave it at, right? Like without getting in, but like I think at least the power dynamics for me displayed in that moment that there are certain priorities that people in power have versus, people that are kind of boots to the ground doing this work, supporting that. My interests might be different than those that are in positions of power, and they might have a whole different group of individuals that they have to report to and have to navigate through.
I really appreciate your response because when you were sharing the impact of Charlottesville and you started talking about the steps, you created a comprehensive communication plan to your key stakeholders. You made certain that the physical space was accessible. You made sure that there were resources available to your key stakeholders, your students, your volunteers in the physical space. So you were approaching this already from an equity lens, from a multitude of things.
Yeah.
A lot of times when I'm talking with people, it's always, what does this look like? What does this sound like? Right? I always go back to thinking about when D.L. Stewart wrote about the difference between equity and diversity and us really being there. We have to hear it. We sometimes have to see it. And
Mhm.
so I wanted to bring that up because I don't think that everyone approaches this work when we start thinking about crises, of thinking about having our own communications plan. Sometimes it's, what does our communications lead in our school or our college or our university say? We try to follow that because that's what we're told, but it seems as though you as a leader knew that this moment in time was not just defining, but there was a lot happening. And so I appreciate how you've unpacked that, because someone can look and say, oh, well, did you get approval before you sent this out? Like everybody thinks about logistics. Did you get approval? Did you find the hierarchy? Did you follow through what you've been told? And what I'm picking up from what you did is you said there are both short-term things that you had to do and also long-term. And that is a lesson because we're so immediately focused. If I do this, then this. And then we get stuck as leaders sometimes thinking about the potential consequences and not necessarily having a really good framing of
Mhm.
organization and prioritization of what we need to do. But not everything is a Charlottesville moment. Not everything is going to be something that, was a defining moment in higher ed. I think, wahoo wah all day, I bleed blue and orange, right? And so that community and that campus has significant meaning for me. And so just watching it as an alum, watching what was happening, knowing I had friends and folks on that campus at that time, I was concerned about safety. I was concerned about the students, and I was concerned about the community. And what you described was you were concerned about safety. You were concerned about students. You were concerned about the community. And so I appreciate you just even affirming some of the concerns that I had as the outsider who's connected to the community looking in. And so I just wanted to highlight the value of what you said, because as leaders, we need to think about this. It's almost like you have to train yourself before these things happen. And we don't always get that privilege, but that's why this podcast exists, so that people can listen and get some ideas about how to reframe their work. But as we, move the conversation forward, I'm really interested in learning more about some actionable strategies that people can do in this work. There are so many shifting dynamics that are happening politically, educationally, financially, economically. There's so much going on right now. We're in a lot of transition, and we'll be moving forward for months, if not years. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is, how would you give strategies, actionable specifically strategies, to our audience about moving forward and being able to lead through crisis, being able to move forward and do a pivot, as your story has shown, being able to even pivot in your career? And I know that you do this not just at the campuses that you've had the privilege of working with, but you have an international impact in some of the work that you do. And I think that some of the actionable strategies that you can share can kind of be banked in that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Obviously, I think one of the things that you can do right now is, as an actual in crisis, is one, making sure before any crisis happens is to be able to educate yourself and really understand the language that you can use, understand your positionality. And so a lot of it's self work, right? Like the communication plan that was created, that was done because I was like, oh, if we ever have a situation that arises, safety is the forefront of my mind. That plan was created prior to any, you know, Charlottesville event of neo-Nazis and white supremacists coming. That was created just in case something happened, right? And we tailored it a little bit based on kind of the event. But I think what I did was I did my research, right? As a scholar, I made sure to look up, what are the best practices, right? I made sure to look up what are, for at least for the communication plan, what's an easy way to be able to reach out and connect with, or send messaging out to a mass group of people, right? That the text message service was something that students can opt into. And it wouldn't have to be an email that we can send, because sometimes students don't look at your email right away, right? So I really educated myself, and I think that's something that people can really do, right? Looking up both in higher ed, what are the best practices around navigating through crisis? And I think also steps that you can do is, you can look at crises that have happened in the past and see what's worked and what hasn't worked, as a way to do that. And that's one thing that you can really do, I think, when we think about kind of the global perspective, to realize that your identity, your positionality isn't the only other piece. So when I was at the University of Wisconsin overseeing global DEI, I realized very quickly that a lot of people that were focusing on a DEI work didn't have some of the same challenges that students have. So, for example, like some of the things that I did, I think when you navigate through crisis, is that for at least for like the global DI person, when you think about DI, you don't think about the international students who are coming from different countries, right? You have to think about, there might be a language barrier, there might be the visa piece, right? Like J1, F1 visas, right? I mean, we don't have to worry about, students who like live in the States can go to their families if they can, versus international students, who had to navigate. Do I go back to my country, but then risk not being able to come back for my visas issues? Like, those are the things that I think are really important that we do. And so it's really about self-educating yourself is first and foremost. Another step that I think people can do is, when you're dealing with a crisis, is like, I've mentioned this, but you engage with impacted communities first, right? I think that it's the foremost. You have to listen to those that are directly impacted, right? You have to make sure that you host, safe spaces, you host these confidential spaces where individuals can share their experiences and their needs without fear and judgment or retaliation. I think two, you have to also, I think what you can do is reaffirm your organizational values publicly. One, you can also be able to focus on long-term change. So I think you can use these moments as catalysts, to embed equity into your organizational framework. So you can, one of the things I did is I revamped our whole strategic plan after in Charlottesville. I threw away our strategic plan, started from fresh to weave these wave DEI more within our strategic plan. What ended up resulting is our volunteer numbers are increased, our staff dynamic change where we had more staff of color, our campus partnerships increased from 0 to 50, or community partnerships increased to over 225 from 175. And so I think you can be really strategic about doing a self-assessment, right? And then I think finally, I think this is probably the most important piece of actionable steps, is that you can prepare right now for resistance. I think there's a moments where you can recognize and take a bold stance about whatever decision you make, and really equip yourself and your organization with tools to handle that criticism while staying firm to your commitment to equity. And that looks different organization to organization, person to person. And then also to understand your tolerance level, right? Like for me, I'm willing to put my job on the line. I'm willing to put my personal health on the line, to be able to support the communities that I love and care for. And, that might not be everyone's kind of, you might not be in a position to do that, right? You have family commitments, you have other obligations. And so to be able to find your like tolerance level for that, or, it doesn't even have to be for crisis. It's just in general, when any decisions are happening, you can use those steps.
We're talking about this idea of preparing for resistance and, checking your tolerance level and things like this. We always end this show by talking to our guests about what they're doing for their own self-care. So tell us something, just help us as we sort of like do all this heavy work, but now we're sort of trying to come out of it a little bit. What's maybe like one thing that you're doing for yourself just to have some self-care so that you are prepared for this resistance and that you increase maybe your tolerance level for whatever it is that we call it that we have to deal with.
I'm a book lover. I love to read. And, ever since I finished my PhD, I've been focusing on getting back to the love of reading for the sake of reading, right? Not because I have to read a textbook because I have this class, but just because I love reading. And I've been able to read 50 books in the last 5 months, and really been focusing on that. And, for me, it's allowed for me to, one, reclaim, like use these stories as a way to reclaim these dominant narratives that have been either prescribed on me or my community, and to kind of take that back, right? So this power of storytelling, and I think that's the piece what I get with books, right? I feel like you're telling this story from your perspective, and I feel like if a person was telling a story, it'd be very different if 50 different people did that same story, right? It'd be very different. And I think that's what I love about reading. There's so many versions of different books. And I've been loving to read books that brought me joy when I was a child, right? Like I've been reading these books that I read in like high school and middle school that my partner is like, why are you reading that book, right? Like it doesn't seem, but for me, it brings me a lot of joy because it's rekindling kind of how I felt, that innocence as a child. And that's honestly what I use to stay sane, right? To be able to focus on that self-care. I listen to a book when I'm going to work, and when I'm going back, I read for an hour before I go to bed, and it's been really good for me. So I read, some of these like heavy kind of books that, such as, like I read a lot of books that are by, these activists like Charlene Carruthers, or, I read a lot of books by Kimberly Crenshaw, and all these heavy books. But then I also read books that are just like for me, and that bring me joy, and they might not bring other people joy. And so right now I'm reading 4 different books at the same time, and it's brought me a lot of joy. So on my lunch break, I purposely go out for a walk, and I have my audiobook in, and I just listen for an hour of my lunch break, and I get my steps in, and that helps me kind of center myself and get ready for the next thing that's on my list of things to do.
I'm really feeling like I need to step it up in the consuming of more books from a variety of places, because what we do is always consuming my everyday higher ed. My reading is really on airplanes or when we're on breaks, and I'm reading like John Grisham and David Baldacci. Like I'm out here reading these like really heavy but fictional books. But I just appreciate how you said that you like this focus on story and the imagination. It seems like creativity is a part of your self-care and your release. And I just appreciate just how you've been so transparent in this conversation. As we close out our conversation today, there are some things that I'm taking away, which I think are very important. For me, I'm taking away making sure that I understand how to educate myself on these key pieces of responding to not just major crises, but also maybe conflicts. Thinking about a communications plan, thinking about who are my stakeholders? Who do I need to communicate with? What are the levels of authority I need to consider when sharing that messaging? Are there things that I can do to prepare ahead of a crisis? My favorite question that you stated, or response to a question was in my mind, was you can prepare right now for resistance. Because I was thinking, at what point does a leader need to have this done? Is it once they feel like their staff is in place? Do they need to do it day one? Is it when they feel comfortable and they're all staff? When do you start doing this? But knowing that we can prepare right now for resistance is such an affirming aspect of leadership. And I think for folks listening, resistance doesn't mean that you're the antagonist. It also doesn't mean that it has to be harmful. It can just mean that there's something that's happening right now, something that is affecting key stakeholders' values, the work that you're doing, and you might need to make an action to refuse. And so I just appreciate how you've really used that experience at Charlottesville that was so defining for you to teach us so many ways to approach our leadership from a values-based, person-centered approach.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, and appreciate you just having me on here to share my story.
That wraps up today's episode of After Further Consideration. We hope our conversation has sparked new ideas and provided valuable insights for your own work in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on your campus and beyond.
Thank you for listening in. Remember, fostering meaningful change is a journey. Be encouraged and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in creating a more inclusive educational environment. After Further Consideration is a part of the Enrollify Podcast Network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too.
Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional.
Our shows feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from Brian Piper, Allison Tercio, Eddie Francis, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed.
Enrollify is presented by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.